Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. It's Bakari Lumumba, back once again, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Before we get started, make sure you hit the subscribe and the like button, as well as the notification bell. Have a special topic that we're going to be discussing this evening entitled Why I Am Critical of Critical Theory. For those of you who are in the know, there's been a lot of conversation, much conversation taking place regarding critical race theory, right? Many people argue that critical race theory promotes essentialism, that if you're born into a certain racial, but some would consider caste system. We talk about a racial caste system on another show, built on the great work of Dr. Isabella Wilkinson. But one of the things that they would argue in critical race theory is that, if you're born in a certain way, it teaches you that you can excel in American society. Those of us who are in the know, who are familiar with critical race theory, know that it's not the truth. That's not the case. But many people are unaware of where critical race theory derives from, right? So we're going to be taking a look at critical theory, right? And where it was founded, how it's founded, and why I'm critical, of course, of critical theory. But once again, before we get started, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Then we're going to open things up. Hopefully we can have a great conversation, intellectual conversation that is robust. And then, of course, we'll call it a night. So one of the reasons why I'm doing a show on why I'm critical of critical theory is because yours truly recently had my latest publication in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education. If you're unfamiliar with the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, please check it out. They do some great work in terms of centering the Black experience in higher ed, right? And so I have an article that I wrote in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, of course, entitled Why I'm Critical of Critical Theory. And so I start off by quoting the womanist professor, Audre Lorde. Of course, we know that she passed, but she stated in 1984 that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change, right? And so, but I had that conversation when I open up with that quote because I believe, and of course there's substantial history and literature to substantiate this, that higher education is a site of anti-Blackness, right? And so I'll give you some examples of historical anti-Blackness and, of course, contemporary anti-Blackness. We know historically, higher education was rooted in, of course, not only settler colonialism, but also most of the preeminent and wealthiest and most prestigious higher education institutions. Of course, appreciate you, sister. I'm going to put the article in the chat so you can check out the article. Thank you for asking. Appreciate you chiming in. So I'm going to put the article in the chat, and then you can let me know, of course, if you got the link. But there it is there. And so one of the things that we find in terms of the history of higher education is an issue in which historically and contemporarily, it's been a site of anti-Blackness, right? So we know it was rooted in settler colonialism, racism, exclusion, but also many people are unaware that many of the prestigious and most elite higher education institutions, of course, got their funding. They build up their robust treasure chest, their endowments, based on what not only the funding of the transatlantic slave trade, but also what slave labor as well. If you're unaware of that, there's a great book. I'm trying to see if I can find it real quick, but I don't think I can. Entitled Ebony and Ivory, right? Ebony and Ivory, and it talks about the history, of course, of slavery in America's most prestigious and wealthiest higher education institutions. Many people may even be aware that Thomas Jefferson's intellectual monument, the University of Virginia, in Charlottesville, and we all know what happened in Charlottesville many years ago, but was built primarily by, of course, enslaved Africans. So we know historically higher education has been a site of anti-Blackness, but even contemporarily, right? I make an argument that most historically white institutions are white cultural centers, right? That actually give homage and praise to white settler colonialism. That's times when you go on campus, you see statues erected of devout and openly proud white supremacists, right? And so oftentimes, just being on campus, you're experiencing anti-Blackness, not only in terms of the physical structure and ontology ecology of the campus, but also in terms of the curriculum, right? So when we talk about the classics, when we talk about some of the canonical texts that we find in higher education, oftentimes they're rooted in whiteness, right? And so as a result, there's a spacious exclusion of Black authors, Black critical theorists, Black literature from the canon of what higher education literature. And so that, of course, is an example of anti-Blackness. I think that is rooted in, of course, the belief that, of course, Black people are inferior and, of course, put on the periphery of all things that are rooted in intelligence and of course, education. And also, in my opinion, the curriculum promotes whiteness as the paragon of intellectualism. So, of course, we find that extremely problematic when we know that we are the people who created reading and writing and all of the educational sciences that the world uses today. And so, with that being said, when I talk about why I'm critical, excuse me, let me get a drink of water real quick, of critical theory, many people may be unaware, but critical theory was forced in the academic crucible cauldron of Marxism, right? And so its initial impetus was focusing on socialism's triumph over capitalism. But it moved forward to begin to advocate being critical of societal institutions and social structures, and of course, issues of power and hegemony, right? This concept later became known as the Frankfurt School, right? Also known as the Institute for Social Research, right? So this took place in the 1920s in Frankfurt, Germany. But I find that to be extremely problematic, and I'm gonna tell you why. Because this whole concept of being critical and questioning societal structures and power and hegemony, we tend to find that in the Frankfurt School, it's highlighted by its lack of self-reflection, right? And so there's a specious omission of the Black subaltern, right? Black writers. That's a substratum, of course, of criticality and critical theory. And so I'm going to go into why I believe that is the case. You know, there's many scholars who have argued that critical theory simply is a white men having conversations with themselves, right? And so they always giving themselves a big up. But I argue that the unwillingness of critical theory, right, to center the work of one Carter G. Woodson, right, who wrote Miseducation of the Negro, right, one of W.E.B. Du Bois and his work in Souls of Black Folk that he wrote in 1903, right, and of course the work of Anna Julia Cooper, A Voice from the South, which predates the formation of the Frankfurt School and critical theory, is an example, of course, of anti-Blackness, right, and so I argue that what we have to do is not seek to include ourselves into, of course, the so-called critical canon, but to create our own canon, right? You know, Malcolm X talked about, when we talk about integration, it's really a process in which the white dominant power structure is able to take the best of Black people and use it to their benefit. So I would argue for the creation of a Black critical canon. There is a such thing as Black critical theory, of course, that argues, that looks to interrogate specifically anti-Blackness in not only the Western world, but globally, because many people argue who are Black critical theorists, or even what some people call Afro-pessimists, that even to this day, Blackness has a antagonistic relationship with the possibility of humanity, right? But with that being said, my argument is that we need to create a Black critical canon that isn't just rooted in, of course, what many would argue the modern criticality, but we're talking about going all the way back to ancient Kemet, Fahotep, of course, all the way to Malcolm X and so on and so forth. So that's the argument I'm making as to why I'm critical of critical theory. Once again, I'm not speaking against critical race theory, although critical race theory, of course, is a derivative of critical theory, same as intersectionality, right? But those are conversations we can have for another day. But what I am going to do, now that I got that off my chest, is open this up and we could just kind of have a more broad conversation. I just put the link in the chat. Have a more broad conversation about anti-Blackness in higher education. People could tap in, maybe share their experiences regarding anti-Blackness. Once again, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. And as I always state before, you don't have to cam up, right? You could come on, give your perspective, but you don't have to cam up to do so. Give your perspective on anti-Blackness. Did you experience this in terms of culturally, the campus ecology? Was it in the curriculum that, of course, or the syllabi or syllabus? So just want to have a great conversation regarding anti-Blackness and higher education. And of course, maybe you could share your thoughts on why I'm critical, of course, of critical theory. But once again, I'm not critical of critical race theory, which is a derivative of critical theory, but we're talking about being critical of critical theory and the belief that the Frankfurt School, of course, is the parent of is the progenitor, of course, of critical theory and criticality. I would argue that if you want to look at the true progenitors of critical theory and criticality, you have to look at the work of one W.E.B. DuBois, one Angela Cooper, or of course, one Carter G. Woodson. So with that being said, of course, the link is in the chat. I just opened that up. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button as well as notification bell. If you would like to leave comments in the chat, that is great as well. I can take questions as well. So looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. And so once again, the conversation, the topic is why I am critical of critical theory. I know Sister Carrie asked for the link to the article, so I put that in the chat. And I see that you stated that you have that, so that is greatly appreciated. So once again, why I'm critical of critical theory. Please tap in, share your thoughts, give a perspective on, of course, my criticality of critical theory, but also anti-Blackness and higher education. Do you believe it's pervasive? Do you believe it's omnipresent? Is it ubiquitous? Or do you think it's maybe, hey, we're just making this up and we're too sensitive, we're in our feelings, right? What are your thoughts on microaggressions? But once again, the link is in the chat. Would love for someone to tap in, share their thoughts, their perspectives. You don't have to cam up, or you could just simply ask questions, put the questions in the chat, then I can respond and answer that way as well. So definitely want to have a great conversation today regarding why I'm critical of critical theory. Once again, as I said it before, my latest publication, which can be found at the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, is out, is on the web. And of course, I'm doing this show because the title of my latest publication, of course, is Why I'm Critical of Critical Theory. And so as a result of that, I wanted to do a show where we kind of have a brief conversation about that. Of course, we all know that, should know that anti-Blackness is pervasive in higher education. Is historical as well as contemporary, right? And I kind of touched on historical issue, of course, of many of the elite higher education institutions having their hands, of course, in the transatlantic slave trade, of course, chattel enslavement, but also being rooted in settler colonialism, exclusion, whiteness, and of course racism. But even contemporarily, we could talk about the campus, of course, ecology in terms of almost as a white cultural center. Oftentimes there are monuments and statues to prominent white supremacists. And then last but not least, we can have a conversation about the new plantation, of course, which is what we find with many Black athletes who are, of course, playing basketball, football, and other various sports for these historically white institutions who have a history of exclusion, are now using that Black athletic labor as a way to, unfortunately, rake in billions, if not trillions of dollars in TV deals, so on and so forth. So definitely would love to have a conversation about anti-Blackness in higher education. Is it pervasive? Is it ubiquitous? Is it omnipresent? But then, of course, we can also have a conversation about why I'm critical of critical theory. So please tap in. Once again, you don't have to cam up, but would love to hear you all's perspectives regarding the topic. And of course, if you don't even want to cam up, if you don't want to tap in that way, you could also leave questions in the chat. But we're talking about anti-Blackness in higher education, as well as, of course, why I'm critical of critical theory. And I would just reiterate ad nauseum one more time, and that is that I'm not being critical of critical race theory, right? Many people, unfortunately, have a misunderstanding of what critical race theory is. I've known, even when I've watched some news shows, that there have been individuals who have come on and spoken out against critical race theory, but they couldn't even tell someone what the core tenets of what critical race theory was. So I would, of course, assume that if you're going to be against something, you should at least know what it is that you're against. But also, but I'm being critical of critical theory. And as many of you may know or may not know, critical race theory is a derivative, of course, of critical race theory. But don't feel intimidated to come on the show. I'm not going to be didactic in terms of my conversational tone. Simply just want to have a conversation, get you all's thoughts. If you haven't been to college, if you haven't experienced what it's like to live or work or study in higher education. We can even extrapolate the conversation to what secondary education, K through 12, and we could talk about anti-Blackness and K through 12 education as well. So definitely looking forward to having that conversation. I know I've had several conversations with individuals who, Black people who've gone to Christian schools due to their parents, of course, being of the Christian faith and believing that they wanted them to have a deeply religious, of course, educational upbringing. However, only to find out that, of course, going to a Christian school, they were typically learning white supremacy, and unfortunately, cultivate what actually being nurtured, or I wouldn't say the word nurtured, but actually educating a culture that oftentimes stifled, and of course, created some negative concepts and connotations of what it is to be Black. So, Sister Carrie, you said regarding anti-Blackness and microaggression, I experienced that in grade school. When I read the book Push Out, I realized that my friends and I experienced what the book stated. That's great. How about you come on? You don't, like I said, you don't have to cam up, but I would love to hear your perspective on this. So maybe you could jump on the live. You don't have to cam up, but I would love for you to, articulate verbally your experience regarding anti-Blackness. And I am familiar with the book Push Out. And for those in an audience who are unaware of Push Out, many scholars argue that Black children typically don't drop out of school. They're pushed out of school. And oftentimes it's due to what? Anti-Blackness, microaggressions, overall the negative experiences that they've had throughout secondary education that leads to what many people argue is what? Racial battle fatigue. And as a result, they kind of throw their hands up and say, hey, this isn't for me. This isn't the place for me. So they are pushed out of school rather than being kicked out of school. And we know that push out oftentimes, unfortunately, leads to what? Going straight is part of that school to prison pipeline phenomenon. So, Sister Carrie, I definitely appreciate you bringing that up. Once again, I would love for you to come on the show. Once again, you don't have to cam up. You could keep your camera off, but I would love for you to share your perspective regarding what you experienced in grade school. You can let us know what metropolitan area you attended school in, and I would love to, hear your story. But once again, we're having a conversation about anti-Blackness in higher education. And as I stated earlier, if you haven't attended college or university, we can have a conversation about anti-Blackness in secondary education, i.e. K through 12, right? And of course, we're talking about why I'm critical of critical theory. Appreciate the new subscriber from Boston. Tap in, be part of the conversation. I would love for you to be part of the conversation. So we're talking about why I'm critical of critical theory. I'm not talking about being critical of critical race theory, although critical race theory is a derivative of critical theory. I'm simply talking about critical theory, which is seen as oftentimes the paragon intellectually of criticality, of course, this concept of questioning and challenging and troubling issues of hegemony, issues of power, and issues of course, oppression. So, Sister Carrie, I appreciate you tapping in. So you talked about experiencing anti-Blackness and microaggressions in grade school. So please, if you could share more. That'd be great.
Good evening, Professor Lumumba. Can you hear me? You can? Okay. So, as I stated in the chat regarding feeling criminalized or relating to the book Push Out, so like I'm from New York and I'm first generation Liberian American,
Okay, what borough are you in?
Far
Oh,
Rockaway, Queens.
Far
That's
Rockaway.
where I was.
Okay, shout out to Queens. Okay, no doubt. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so
I've been to Far
it
Rockaway, by the way. So
okay,
I know exactly where you at.
sounds good.
Yeah.
So when my family moved to the Poconos in Pennsylvania, so the town is around that time, the 90s, early 2000s, the majority of the people were white, and then they had some black people and other people of color. So there were some incidents in school where um sometimes like the our white female classmates would be very like would be kind of say racist things or say things that were inappropriate, and then when
Could you give an example?
um like okay, let me think back. So some of them, like, that just the way how they described our hair, having natural hair, calling it Brillo pad,
Mm,
um, touching it, not putting hands to them, not keeping their hands to themselves. And then when we say something back, because I know I think I said something about horsehair.
mm.
That's how I referred to this person's hair as horsehair.
Okay.
And then she cried to the teacher,
Oh man.
and then I got in trouble, I told the teacher I was called a name, and how come I'm getting in trouble and she's not?
Right.
So that's my problem, and then also using the white woman tears or white girl tears, and then playing the victim,
Hmm.
being passive aggressive. And then when you're called out on your behavior, then you want to play victim.
Right.
And then the person who says something, speaks out on your behavior, calls out your behavior, they get in trouble for it. So that's some of the stuff I experience.
Got you. Got you. So real quick before I respond, just going to take a pause for the calls, do a brief commercial. If you're watching, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. We're having a conversation about why I am critical of critical theory. As I stated before, my latest publication, you can find it at the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, where I'm discussing why I'm challenging the criticality, of course, of critical theory. Once again, if you are unaware, I'm not challenging critical race theory, I'm challenging critical theory. Of course, that's the paragon of all things intellectual when it comes to challenging issues of hegemony, power, and of course, oppression. I believe that if anyone or any entity should be considered the progenitor of criticality, it should be the triumvirate of Black scholars at the turn of the 20th century. We're talking about Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Dr. W.E.B. DuBois, and of course, Queen Mother Anna Julia Cooper. So, with that being said, Sister Carrie, appreciate you. So, you experienced this, and you described it as being part of push out. So I can understand where you're coming from, going to school every day, and you're in an environment in which you are not liked. That's going to weigh on you, of course, psychologically, to where maybe you start questioning, not liking yourself. No one wants to continue to go to an environment where they feel like they're not liked or not wanted. So I would presume that affected your ability to learn. Was there ever a time where you thought about dropping out of school as a result of the racial microaggressions and anti-Blackness that you experienced?
No, I would say the reason why, because at home I had a good foundation
Okay.
of my parents who would always encourage us, and they were big educators. So my father's a retired social studies teacher. My
Okay.
mother also was in education. So they laid that foundation, and when I would tell them those things, they will speak words of affirmation to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what helped me in the support. And they realize, you know, there's some racism going on in that place.
Okay.
And then
All
they
right.
themselves have experienced it.
Right. And so you've described interpersonal racism. Did you experience racism scholastically in terms of the curriculum, the books you read, so on and so forth, in which there was an
Um,
omission of Black people and Black contributions, not only to civilization, but of course throughout humanity as well?
I remember in middle school reading the book Thomas Sawyer,
Okay. Tom,
and
yes.
and my father was upset that we were reading that. And he said that we shouldn't be, he said this book is very, racist. Why are you all reading this book?
Right.
I
Okay.
remember that. So that's an example. Um, and of course, like regarding Black history or anything African diasporan history related, it's very vague. It's the
Absolutely.
same old typical things, but they
Right.
didn't like go in depth. The
Right.
only time you would like get those kind of education regarding our history was when you were probably in college.
This is very true. And I'm glad you brought that up, because even though, of course, we do know that anti-Blackness is pervasive in higher education. However, what is ironic is that when you are in higher ed, you actually learn true history, right? So we know K through 12, you're going to learn that what? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, right? However, when you
Right.
go to college or the university, you actually learn that he was lost, right? The Native Americans saved him, and in return, he killed them and enslaved them, right? So and you could be so it's wild, but oftentimes we know that's the exclusivity of higher education to where most people don't have access to that information, right? And so that's an
Correct.
issue. So let me ask you this. Um, and because I put the link to the article in the chat. So the question is, did you have a chance to peruse the article?
Not just yet. I was planning on reading it tomorrow.
Okay, no problem, no problem. So we're having a conversation. Of course, we're talking about being critical of critical theory, based on what I stated about why I wrote the article. I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of about being critical of critical theory. I don't know if you're too familiar with critical theory, but also your thoughts on creating a Black critical canon rather than trying to integrate ourselves into this literary and intellectual sea of whiteness.
Um, so when you say that, it made me think of the late Marcus Garvey.
Yes, ma'am. Shout out to Marcus Garvey. His birthday was just 5 days ago.
Yes, last week.
Absolutely.
And how, the whole Pan-Africanism, how to teach our community, how to teach Black people, regardless if you're African American, African, Afro Caribbean, Afro Latin, how we are all interconnected and we share a root. We might come from different branches, but we all share the same root.
Absolutely. And I think that is a great point, right? Because we know that oftentimes one of the critiques of Pan-Africanism, and I am of course a Pan-Africanist, but I'm critical of Pan-Africanism as well. And shout out to Mr. Untouchable. Appreciate you coming out here. Hey, I would love it. That's right, provisional president of Africa, talking about one Marcus Garvey. Hope you could join the conversation as well. But when we talk about Pan-Africanism, one of the things that Pan-Africanism teaches is not that we're all the same people, right? But it's that understanding that anti-Blackness is ubiquitous, right? And that whatever racism or oppression or microaggressions or structural or institutional or even interpersonal racism or anti-Black events we're facing is connected to a global system of course, anti-Blackness, right? And so many people are unaware that is one of the main tenets, of course, of Pan-Africanism, is understanding that the issues we're facing, irrespective if we're in Chicago, if we're in Harare, Zimbabwe, if we are in Seattle, Washington, or even if we are in, of course, Buenos Aires, these issues, or even Sydney, Australia, these issues are rooted in a global system, of course, of anti-Blackness that seeks to disrupt and, of course, prevent Black progress, irrespective of where we are in the world. Yes. So, of course, go ahead, Sister Carrie.
Absolutely. I was agreeing to what you said.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful. And so, once again, but I apologize for cutting you off. I tend to be a bit loquacious at times, right? But I'd ask you about your thoughts of being, of course, critical theory.
Well, so regarding the critical theory, are you talking about critical race theory?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. Not talking about critical race theory. We're talking about critical theory, of course. So, and I'll give a little background. Critical theory came out of the academic cauldron, of course, of Marxism, right? And so, as a result, critical theory was created in the 1920s. The Frankfurt School in Frankfurt, Germany, with a bunch of German Jewish academics, right? And so they created this school of thought where they would be critical of course, systems of power, hegemony, oppression, social structures, etc., right? And so critical race theory is a derivative of course, critical theory. But, of course, it pays homage to the critical theorists, who are all white men, as being the progenitors of this concept of looking at society and critiquing oppression. And I'm arguing that is not actually correct, that there's been an omission of Black people's contributions to critical theory and criticality, particularly the triumvirate of course, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who, of course, is the creator of Black History Week, which became Black History Month. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, who wrote his most notable text, So is the black folk in 1903. And of course, Queen Mother, the Pan-Africanist, the educated, the womanist. We're talking about none other than Anna Julia Cooper, who wrote her seminal text, A Voice from the South, of course, in 1892.
Okay, yes. So regarding that, and then as you stated before, how regarding critical theory is they're always paying homage to white men, but
Yes, ma'am.
then they're not um it's not regarding people of color, black people or other people of color who have contributed to critical theory.
Yes.
So I understand why you are critical on critical theory when is one group is being recognized and another group is being slept on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, I even kind of push back against the whole concept of people of color, right? Because unfortunately, we know that even other people of color tend to practice anti-blackness as well.
Absolutely.
I actually read a great piece a couple of years ago where they talked about how anti-blackness oftentimes is rooted in many of other people of color's culture. And of course, there's even a very strong sister. She's a warrior scholar. She's a professor of anthropology and African American studies at Purdue University. And she wrote a book called Muslim Cool, where she talks about how Islam coalesces with immigrant Muslims to create an actually volatile cocktail of anti-blackness in American society, in which Black Muslims are pushed to the periphery of the Ummah or the Muslim community due to the fact of what they consider not only them being considered infidels because of their blackness, but also because of their lack of geographical proximity to, of course, the Arabian Holy Land, which is known as Mecca. So, I mean, it's a great read. I actually wrote a book review on the book, but it didn't get published. But yeah, if you ever get a chance to check out, and I'll put that in the chat, the book is called Muslim Cool. Yes. So once again, just want to touch base, take a pause for the cause. This is Lumumba Speaks, Carl Lumumba, LumubaSpeaks.com, where we always bet on Black. Once again, having a conversation about why I'm critical of critical theory, not critical race theory. We're going to do a show on critical race theory, but why I'm critical of critical theory, right? And my argument that I've actually, I believe, eloquently stated in my treatise is that I believe that the three scholars, preeminent scholars at the turn of the 20th century in Black America, we're talking about one, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, and of course, Queen Mother Anna Julia Cooper, should be considered the progenitors, of course, of critical theory and, of course, what is considered criticality. And so that this spacious omission is another example of course, what? Anti-Blackness, even in a space that's supposed to be inclusive and willing to actually interrogate the very issues that cause us harm. And so we know, as Marcus Garvey always taught us, that in a world of wolves, the only solution, of course, is race first. And so with that being said, sister, I'm going to give you the floor once again.
So yes, going back to in regards to like persons of color,
Yes, ma'am.
and personally, I don't refer to myself as a person of color. I like to say that I'm Black because, as what you stated before, yes, I'm a person of color, but I prefer to say that I'm a Black woman because I know that there are non-Black people of color who can be anti-Black, who can be prejudiced against Black people.
Exactly. Absolutely. 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 So that is a great point. Yes, and I think unfortunately, oftentimes, and this is just my opinion, so you could push back on this if you want, but I think oftentimes what we tend to find is a situation in which, unfortunately, oftentimes what we find is there's a lack of belief, of course, in African agency. There's a lack of a belief that, hey, we can do these things ourselves. And so we always find ourselves running to other groups of people to help us do what we can and should be doing for ourselves. And so I think that's one of the major issues is there's a lack of course, agency. And some of that, of course, comes from what you stated, that lack of a good foundation at home. We know the African proverb teaches us what? that the ruin of a nation begins in the homes of its people, not in the schools, not in the rec center, not down the block and around the corner, but in the homes of the people. So if we aren't cultivating in the younger generation and our children a belief in ourselves that we can strive and be successful on our own and not seeking the help or largesse of others, then I think we will continue to find this issue take place. And I've always argued, as did Dr. Amos Wilson many years ago, that of all the issues that we find in our community, of course, of anti-Blackness, of course, in the curriculum or on the campus ecology or microaggressions, is rooted, he would argue, and I would agree, not collective political, economic, and military powerlessness. So what say you?
Okay, yes. Also, I wanted it's something like I also thought about. There's a lot of it's a good conversation, a lot of
Mhm,
things I'm thinking of in my head and so forth. And another example I want to give growing up where so I was with my reading, I was a little below, I guess my level was I wasn't so advanced as
mhm.
some students. So then I was always placed in a lower level reading class,
Right.
and I would get extra help just to help. And then I guess my parents saw it as, me receiving extra help. So I think I was in that lower level reading class from kindergarten to fifth grade.
Hmm.
So when I got, and then I began to put two and two together, where like I started to realize, okay, so they have the lower level reading class, they have, I guess, those who are average, and then the other kids who are advanced. So when I got to fifth grade, I put two and two together, and I came home and I complained to my parents. I said they have me in the lower level reading class, and I need to be at least in the average or advanced level. And I just feel like they always, and in majority of the kids who were in that class again were black or a person of color. And not to say that they had black students in the average, the so-called advanced level reading class. So I brought it to my parents' attention and then just complained because I just didn't, I was upset. So then, my parents agreed to, like, my mom went with me. The next day, my mom went with me to the school. I think she wrote a letter first, and then they scheduled a meeting with herself and me and I. And I explained to them, I think now it's time for me to go up another level, even if I can go in the advance. It didn't really matter for me. So as long as I wasn't placed in that lower level reading class. So we went and explained to them it was time for me to go ahead and go into the average level. So then they placed me there, and it's like, oh, I see that you're upset, and talking like that, a little condescending. I was
Hmm.
like, no. And then, if it's too hard for you, you can always go back. I was like, no, it's not hard for me. It's not going to be hard for me. So I ended up going in that class, the average, and I did good. And then the following year, went on to sixth grade, and we had moved to Charlotte for a little bit, and they put me in the advanced level. And even up until the time I graduated from high school, they had me in advanced placement. But yet I was struggling with reading. But I went from that, and it ended up being taking AP English classes. All my classes were AP and honors.
So
So again, go
I'm sorry.
ahead.
So basically, what you're stating is that they were structurally trying to what inhibit your progress academically.
To an extent, I will say
Okay. Okay. And so
that particular school district, I believe that they do that to black kids, or people, kids who are of color.
right. Well, most school districts, right? Like
Well,
I
yeah,
said, we
yes,
tend to find that what, unfortunately, education institutions, we're talking about secondary or post-secondary, tend to be what sites of anti-blackness, right? We're talking about microaggressions. We're talking about what verbal assaults, even sometimes physical assaults, right? Not only
absolutely.
the fact, like, matter of fact, I went to an elementary school that was in Jefferson Elementary. I didn't know at the time, but when I got older, I realized that what it was named after Thomas Jefferson, who was a racist, who was a raper of black women, right? Who was a pedophile, if you know. And
Yes.
there was a huge statue of him in the school, right? So once again, we talk about
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about the campus ecology, they pay homage to white supremacists, right? So what effect does that have on a black child's mind, right? So once again, make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. And we're having a conversation about and not only anti-blackness in higher education, but also anti-blackness in K through 12 secondary education. And we're discussing my latest publication, which is published in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, Why I Am Critical of Critical Theory. Once again, I'm not talking about being critical of critical race theory, we're talking about why I'm critical of critical theory. Would love for you to join the conversation. You could tap in. You don't have to cam up, but you can tap in, or you can share comments in the chat. Make sure you, before you leave, though, you hit the subscribe and the like button, as well as the notification bell to be updated on future videos. So, sister, you were describing a situation in which there were structural barriers in the school that tried to, of course, prevent or inhibit your progress educationally as a student.
Yes.
And so,
And
go ahead. I'm sorry.
what was your question?
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned that, and so the next question I was going to ask, of course, was how were you able to combat that?
I again being able to discuss this with my parents, and them, can them themselves reading through the lines and knowing about these kind of systems.
Mm-hmm.
That's what helped us. That's what helped me, my siblings and I, to
Yes,
navigate. And they were aware of it, and they weren't, sometimes some parents, some family members, or black families aren't aware of this.
right.
Even going to like the what is it, the IEP
Yes,
and
yes.
so forth,
No educational,
going to that
right? And they,
as well.
yeah, go right ahead. I know what you're talking about.
Yes. And then, you're thinking, oh, it's just special, just trying to get to help your children and so forth.
Right.
I understand someone might need it, fine. I'm not bashing anyone who decides to do that with their child. I understand, because
Mm-hmm.
I am a parent myself.
Yes,
But you still, like, again, it's always, whenever you see a black child, it's always trying to label them with something.
absolutely, absolutely.
And
And I can speak to that if you give me a second. My son is
mhm,
15 now, but I can recall when he was 2 years old. So I was preparing and prepping for him entering, unfortunately, the American educational system. And I read a book entitled "Kill Them Before They Grow." It was entitled "Kill Them Before They Grow: The Misdiagnosis of Black Children in American Classrooms." It talks about how at a very early age they try to state that black children have some type of issues educationally, right? That they put them in these special programs, IEPs, put them on a track to where, of course, they aren't being pushed academically. So I can even recall that I gave a talk at a higher education institution, and it was entitled, if I can remember correctly, it has something to do with social justice. Where do we go from here, right? Because unfortunately, the situation with George Floyd. And one of the things I say to them that if you really want to help Black students, and this I was talking to K through 12 administrators and educators, I said you need to challenge them intellectually. But we know oftentimes, unfortunately, iron sharpens iron, right? If you ever played any sports, or any type of sport. I'm not talking about just physical. It could even be something that as it uses the mind, like chess. You get better by people challenging you, right? But
mhm.
unfortunately, we tend to find that doesn't happen. We are passed along. And as Dr. Huey P. Newton stated in his memoir, Revolutionary Suicide, he argued that his diploma was a farce because it did not give him the requisite skills necessary to be able to compete efficaciously in, of course, a ever-growing and changing American society.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up chess. I was about to mention chess. And I'm not that great of a player. I know a little bit. However, my dad is a master. And
Well,
although he's
I'm gonna have to put that to the test because I put in some work on the chessboard. So you tell your pops to show up and show out because I got something for him. I'm joking, but
okay. Okay.
I,
All
I
right. All right. I'll let him know.
absolutely.
And as I stated earlier, my father is a retired social studies teacher.
Yes,
And now some from time to time he will substitute, and he is a part of the chess club at the school, and he teaches his students how to play chess, and and then they're thinking, because it's something that involves critical thinking when you're playing chess, and which helps the students. And so when he comes home and tells us of the experience that with his students.
Mhm. Absolutely. And of course, with my children, I have a son and daughter. My son is 15, my daughter is 12. I started them playing chess when they were 12 years old. And actually, I would take them to the chess club, my hometown, Dayton, Ohio. Shout out to the Gym City 937, West Dayton Strong Stand Up, right? But the Dayton Chess Club is in downtown Dayton, West 5th Street. And so every Thursday, I was able to take them down there, and just $4, they was able to get individual instruction from chess masters, right? And so the reason why chess, I believe, is important, and many people who work with Black children advocate playing chess, right? Teaching them chess
Yes.
at an early age, because of what? It teaches them to be analytical, right? It teaches them to be able to think in a fast-paced manner. They're able to solve problem after problem after problem. And the good thing is, not only does it take a lot of time, so you don't have to worry about your child brain cells being destroyed by watching TV all day, but
I agree.
also, this is a game in which it doesn't matter how big, how strong, how fast you are. If you want to win, you have to be able to use your mind, right? You have to be able to think intelligently. And we know that when we go out into society, and if we want to be able to combat anti-Blackness, irrespective of where we are in the world, we have to be able to think our way through the problem, right? Because as we know, we can't, bust our head up against the wall like they do in the movies and somehow be free.
Absolutely. That was a great point.
Yes. And so, and I think it's very important. As I stated before, the ruin of a nation begins in homes of its people. I can call my son. I could give an example of anti-Blackness, of course, in a secondary educational curriculum, where my son is in a classroom. I think he was in second grade at the time, and it's Black History Month. Oh, you mentioned Black History Month, so I'm so glad I'm coming back to this. And the teacher said Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and my son's hand shot up. Boom! Right, hand shot up. And he said, Abraham didn't free the slaves. We freed ourselves, and we're still fighting to free ourselves. And the teacher just said, okay. So, of course, she tells me about it when I pick him up. And I said, well, do you know why he stated this? She said, well, no, I really don't see the issue. It was a white woman, right? White teacher. I said, because.
Of course.
Right. I said, the narrative of this man freed Black people, of course, omits the years, right? The 44 years that Black people were fighting and never acquiesced their humanity, never acquiesced their Africanness, never acquiesced and capitulated to believe that we were beasts of burden and made only for servitude. So I said, you just throwing all that out the window. But I said, the second issue is you're creating a narrative and an ideology that teaches Black people at a very early age that whenever something good has happened for Black folk, it was at the largesse of white people, right? And this is what Dr. Carter G. Woodson mentioned in his book that was written in 1933. But unfortunately, if you read it today, you think it was published yesterday, The Miseducation of the Negro, that if you control a man's thinking, you don't have to tell him to go here or go there. You don't have to tell him to go to the back door, he states, right? In fact, if there isn't a back door, he will build one. Why? Because his education makes it necessary. So I'm going to give some contemporary examples, right? We talk about historically here in America, right? We know that historically in America, what took place when Black people got on the bus, where did we have to go?
Is this a question for me?
Yes, it is.
To work?
Well, when we got on the bus, what section of the bus did we have to go?
Oh, okay. Well, the back of the bus.
Exactly. Nowadays, when Black folk get on the bus, particularly Black youth, where in the HE hockey sticks do they go?
To the back of the bus. Everybody growing up, everybody wanted to sit in the back of the bus.
Exactly. Because our education, our socialization, the indoctrination of internalized anti-Blackness made it what? One more time for the audience. It made it what? Necessary. Right? So this is an example of what anti-Blackness being pervasive, it being internalized, and then us living it out and actualizing it. I give you another example. We know in America, Black life has never been of value. This is a reality. This is why we could be killed at any moment, right? By the police, by white vigilantes, etc., etc. What do we find? Black people now don't value Black life. Hey, I don't have a a problem with clapping that boy like it's Birdman and Clips, because I'm only going to get about a deuce and a quarter. I'm only going to get about 12 years. I'm only going to get a dime and a nickel. I'll be home in 15. But tell a black person who's out on the streets, who's a miscreant, who's about that life, who's out there thugging, as you know, to say Negroes is always going to nig, right? Hey, let's clap this white dude who raped this black woman. And what they going to say? I can't do that. They're going to put me under the jail. Now, this isn't just hyperbole. I've had conversations with individuals who was about their life, because I, at one point, was a miscreant. I, at one point, associated with individuals who were ne'er-do-wellers. And these are the type of things they would say. Why? Because anti-blackness is not only pervasive, it's not only ubiquitous, we have internalized it. And this is why the majority of our people, unfortunately, no matter where we are in the world, engage in racially disempowering, self-defeating, and self-destructive behavior that inhibits Black progress.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so the crux of it comes, of course, from education. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, he talked about that when he would go, growing up, he went to, of course, unfortunately, the mission schools on the continent. He said they weren't so much teaching us Christianity as they were teaching us white supremacy, right? They were teaching us to be dependent on them and not do for ourselves, not to think for ourselves, right? That if we did think for ourselves, we were problematic. As you say, the system being criminalized or even being considered a disciplinary problem. And that's another form of anti-Blackness, particularly in secondary education, to where Black children are considered disciplinary problems because we don't respond in a manner that white folk want us to. Okay. So let's shift the conversation a little bit and move it forward and say, so what are some of the solutions? How do we effectively combat the issue, of course, of anti-Blackness, not only in higher education, but also in secondary education? Brother CJ Foster, appreciate you tapping in, brother. If you want, you could be part of the conversation. Once again, you don't have to cam up. You can also simply come on like the Sister Carrie is doing. I just put the link in the chat. But Brother CJ Foster has asked a question. He said, what do you say about people working for and with predominantly white workspaces? So I work in a predominantly white workspace, right? There's what I argue that people should do, of course, is be unapologetically themselves, right? I think oftentimes what tends to take place, if you go into the situation, you go into a white workspace and you start capitulating, you start not being yourself, you start engaging in behaviors to try to get individuals to like you, right? And then as a result, what ends up taking place is what? Then when you try to push back, it's not, you can't push back. You were doing this before, and this is the way we're going to keep it now, right? And so I think that we have to make sure that at all times, of course, you're going to be unapologetically proud of who you are. You do so in a professional manner, but also I would even equate this to sexual harassment. We know oftentimes, unfortunately, for many of our sisters, being beautiful, being attractive is a gift and a curse, right? And so they go into the workplace, there might be some nefarious individuals that want to make some inappropriate comments. And Sister Carrie, I'm sure you could speak on this, so I hope you tap in, right? And so what happens is, if you start laughing and giggling when they first say something that's inappropriate, they got you. But if you check that shit, you G-check that at the front door when it starts, right, then you have more of a space to where, of course, I believe you could be yourself and you can work in an environment that typically is unencumbered of those type of issues. Sister Carrie, what do you say to that?
Yes, so that does happen. Like there's microaggression within the workplace as well, anti-Blackness, and sometimes I notice certain situations you have to say something, you have to speak out, and I know especially somebody that is a Black person, when you say something, they will try to portray you as the angry Black woman or the scary Black man.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, and another thing I want to say, and I don't mean to cut you off, sister, but Brother CJ Foster, one thing you also need to do is document everything. I've worked with some brothers all over the country, in Atlanta, Miami, New York City, shout out to the Boogie Down Bronx, even in Phoenix, Arizona. And one of the issues that would take place when they would have issues in the workplace, I'll give you an example, was there were some brothers that were working at a hospital, and they were some of the orderlies, but they worked in like the infectious disease areas, to where individuals had some type of disease. They were the individuals who went in and cleaned up the operating room afterwards. And they showed up to work. And of course, when you go to a hospital, they have actual police officers who actually actual police officers, and then you have like security. So one security guards yelled out, "Oh, they one of them got a gun!" And of course, the cop pulls out a gun, like, "Oh, where?" Right? Put these brothers' lives in danger. And so what happened is that one of the brothers called me and said, "Hey man, we got a situation. What should we do?" So on and so forth. I said, "The first thing you need to do is you got to rally the troops, right? So because if one person shows up saying this is a problem, they're gonna what? They're gonna just dismiss you. But if you could get those brothers to come together and say, yeah, this is an issue," I told them, put your complaint in writing, right? Have it notarized, but also you need to use what they call legalese. You need to use some legal terms, such as this is a what? Hostile work environment. This is an unsafe work environment. So these are legal terms in writing, notarized, right? And it ain't just you saying it, it's everyone else that was on the shift. Then when you turn that in to file a complaint, now you have some power behind you. And of course, they was able to get the white security guard who made that comment fired. So those are some of the things you want to do if you're trying to push back against anti-Blackness, racial microaggressions, or discrimination in the workplace, right? You can't go it alone. Make sure you put it in writing, and you need to have some backing, particularly, hopefully, if you can, by someone who's in a position of power. And then, of course, put that in writing, have it notarized, and then when you submit your complaint, you have more of a leg to stand on. Sister Carrie, yes.
Yeah, so not the job I was in, but a previous job, I noticed, and especially not only experiencing anti-Blackness, on the other hand, experiencing ageism, because where I work, I was younger than almost everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed the tone, the way how I'm talked to. And there was this particular white male where he talked to me in a very rude way.
Mm-hmm.
So then, so then my Liberian and my New York came out of me, and I told him, "Don't you dare talk to me like that."
Right.
And then he he kind of got a little frightened. And he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you." And again, then he wants to sound nice. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend you. And I didn't mean it like that." And I was like, "You're not offending me, but you will not talk to me that type of way."
Right.
Furthermore, he's from Boston. So
Mm-hmm.
you know how no offense to anybody who's from Boston, you all are ruder than New Yorkers, more
And
rude than New Yorkers.
Boston has a reputation for being not only an extremely racist city, but also an extremely anti-Black city. Many people may be unaware of the um, uh,
Go figure.
many people may be aware of the prize-winning documentary series "Eyes on the Prize." I remember "Eyes on the Prize" because I grew up in school watching "Eyes on the Prize." But many people, when they think of "Eyes on the Prize," they think about the civil rights movement. We know the first episode, and I still remember this, was what Mississippi Is This America, right? And I even had my children watch "Eyes on the Prize," right? And I love the theme song. I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight. Keep your eyes on the prize, right? But when they move forward towards the later episodes, one of the last episodes, I think it was maybe the penultimate episode of the series, it talked about how Boston was a extremely racist and anti-Black city, so much so that when the federal government said, "Hey, we're going to implement the desegregation order that took place back in '54 with Brown v. Board of Education," white folk was like, "Listen." They went around attacking Black people, trying to shut down the schools, so on and so forth, right? So what we find is that even though and from a sporting standpoint, the Boston Celtics organization has always been progressive, right, and willing to promote Black people into positions of power, starting, of course, with the late great Bill Russell that just passed earlier this month. But the city was vehemently anti-Black, and so that is something that I think is rather peculiar. Once again, we're having a conversation about anti-Blackness and higher education. as well as secondary education. So we're having asking the question: do you believe anti-blackness is ubiquitous? Is it pervasive, and of course, is it omnipresent? Also, we're asking the question or discussing why I'm critical, of course, of critical theory. My latest publication, which is, of course, published in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, touches on why I am critiquing the criticality, of course, of critical theory, not to be confused with critical race theory, which, of course, is a derivative of critical theory, right? And so if you want to check out the article, it's in the chat. It's also, if you go on YouTube, it's in the description below there. But also, if you want to tap in, be part of the conversation, you can. You don't have to cam up, but you can be part of the conversation like Sister Carrie is. But last but not least, make sure you hit that subscribe and that like button. And visit, of course, LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe in always betting on Black. Back to you, Sister Carrie. And Brother CJ Foster, if you can, tap in, be part of the conversation. That'd be much appreciated.
Well, again, thank you for inviting me onto your show. Very
Anytime.
informative, and we need to have these type of conversations because it's important for us, and especially those of us who are learning, who may not know, as well as to the youth who are coming up, to teach them these things. So thank you again. And I know it's getting a little late. I will have
Yes, it
to
is.
drop off, but
Yeah.
I will read the article. I emailed it to myself, so I will be reading your article tomorrow,
Okay.
and
And
I'll
please,
let you know
I
my
would love
thoughts.
to hear your thoughts as well. Love it if you could give me some feedback of what you think. That'd be greatly appreciated.
Will do.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so, of course, I appreciate you coming on, Sister Carrie. And once again, you're welcome anytime if you want to come on. Like I stated before, in my position is facts over feelings. You know, you can have a position that is different than my own. Only thing I ask is that you're not intellectually disingenuous, right? Like I said, once again, you could argue that there is no such thing as anti-blackness. I have no problem with that, but you would just need to undergird your argument with factual information. And so, once again, facts over feelings here at Lumumba Speaks. But with that being said, I'll probably go just for a couple more minutes, and then we're going to shut it down. But I think one of the most important things that I want to just touch on in terms of how can we effectively combat anti-blackness, right? And so many people are familiar with the divide or debate between, of course, W.E.B. Du Bois and, of course, Booker T. Washington, but of course, later, one Marcus Garvey, right? And of course, and just kind of just want to, step away from that just very quickly. When I'm from Ohio, right? And so in Ohio, we have a number of major cities: Cincinnati, Dayton, Toledo, Columbus, Akron, Cleveland, and some people even include Youngstown and Canton. And what I've noticed and what I learned is that in every major metropolitan area in Ohio, there are independent Jewish schools, Jewish academies, right? So in the Jewish community, they make it a responsibility of their community, of course, to educate their children with the type of skills and, of course, culture undergirding that they believe is necessary to allow them to compete in a manner in which they are unapologetically proud of who they are in society, irrespective of where they are in the world. I would argue that this needs to happen in the Black community as well. And so many people argue, well, maybe we don't have the funds. I don't think we don't have the funds. I think we lack the desire. But with that being said, even if that is the case, I think what we can do is have what is known as a Juma Mosi Shule, right? And that is what Kiswahili for Saturday school. We could at least have Saturday schools where children are able to get supplemental instruction rooted in what their history, their heritage, and their cultural perspectives, and of course, teach them the skills necessary, not only have the type of cultural and emotional armor to go out into a world that is pervasively anti-Black, but also to give them the confidence and ability to go out and compete, not only in America, but on a global level, because we know we are living in the era of globalization. So with that being said, once again, I'm going to leave it open for a little bit. If anyone wants to come on, share their perspectives on, of course, questioning or even sharing why they would agree or disagree with why I'm critical of critical theory, then, of course, having a brief conversation about anti-Blackness in higher education. Do you believe it's pervasive? Do you believe it's ubiquitous? Do you believe that it's omnipresent? If so, why? If not, why? And then, of course, if you could give some examples as to why you take that position, that, of course, would be greatly appreciated. But, of course, make sure you hit the subscribe and that like button. And, we're always going to, here at Lumumba Speaks, always believe in, always betting on Black. So With that being said, if there is anyone else that's willing to tap in, please read the article. I'm going to put the article once again in the chat. I would love to get some feedback on the article. Once again, this is a publication that I've written in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, entitled "Why I Am Critical of Critical Theory," right? And so once again, we just want to have a brief conversation. Appreciate the sister for coming on. If anyone wants to share their perspectives on anti-Blackness and, of course, higher ed or K through 12, or even questioning why I'm critical of critical theory. Once again, I'm not talking about critical race theory, but critical theory, which of course is a derivative of critical race theory. And I'm just challenging that, of course, the Frankfurt School, of course, is the progenitor of all things critical, and of course, criticality. I believe that it should be rooted in the intellectual triumvirate, of course, of what one Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Dr. W.E.B. DuBois, and Queen Mother Anna Julia Cooper. So Brother Carl Foster saying foster care pushed out a lot of Black teens out of high school. I would love if you could come on and actually share your perspective. What do you mean by that? I'm unfortunately unaware of that taking place in the foster care system. I know there are a number of abuses that take place in the foster care system, but I'm unaware of foster care actually contributing to the push out of Black teens. And we all know that many scholars have called this epidemic of Black students what many people call dropping out. They now calling it a push out, right? In which oftentimes students in a variety of ways are actually being pushed out of the classroom and out onto the streets and along that school to prison pipeline. So Brother Foster, if you could come on, or maybe if you can elucidate in the chat by what you mean by, of course, how the foster care system pushes Black teens out of high school, that would, of course, be greatly appreciated. Okay. And of course, I see we have a couple people here on the live watching, viewing. Please tap in, share your perspectives. You might be a parent who has children, so this might be a topic that is of interest to you. Or, of course, you might be a young adult or an adult who have experienced maybe some microaggressions and disruptions in your secondary or post-secondary academic career, or maybe even in the workplace. Brother C.J. Foster, of course, asked some questions about anti-Blackness in the workplace. How do you handle that? What do you do? How do you combat that, of course? And so I gave what he argued was some solid answers, some tangible answers, right? Based on my experience with helping brothers and sisters who have experienced anti-Blackness in the workplace, right? I know oftentimes, unfortunately, some individuals tell you to pray about it or to, go off and so on and so forth. But I think in all things, we have to make sure that we have a good head on our shoulders and, of course, are able to really address these issues in a manner that's going to be in our best interest. I believe that oftentimes when we're engaging in issues of anti-Blackness or even white supremacy, one of the goals is to have us become reactionary and to react emotionally. And we know, unfortunately, oftentimes for us, is how we respond that becomes a major issue rather than the actual event that took place. So once again, just trying to have a brief conversation before I log off, because it is getting late and I'm on Eastern Standard Time. Regarding why I'm critical of critical theory, and of course having a conversation about anti-Blackness, not only in higher education, but also in secondary education. Is it pervasive? Is it ubiquitous? Is it omnipresent? And if so, what can we do to efficaciously combat anti-Blackness in the educational system here in America? So once again, I put the link to my article, which is published in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, in the chat. And of course, if you want to tap in, I'm going to make sure once again that I put the link in the chat. If you want to tap in and be part of the conversation regarding anti-Blackness in higher education, as well as secondary education. Also, if you want to have a conversation about my article entitled "Why I Am Critical," of course, of critical theory. And once again, just for those who are unaware, I'm not talking about being critical of critical race theory. We know there are a number of people who are critical of critical race theory for a multitude of reasons. And we know oftentimes, unfortunately, individuals who take umbrage with critical race theory oftentimes don't know what critical race theory actually is or what it's about. But I'm seeking to have a conversation in which I'm being critical of critical theory. Critical race theory is a derivative of critical theory, but I'm seeking to be critical of critical theory and the position that many in the of course, academy have taken, that the Frankfurt School, of course, is the progenitor of critical theory and all things rooted in criticality. I believe that that is not true. That it should be that notion should be applied to the triumvirate of Black scholars at the turn of the 20th century, most notably one Carter G. Woodson, Queen Mother Anna Julia Cooper, and of course one W.E.B. Du Bois. So with that being said, please tap in. I'm not going to go too much longer, but would love to have a conversation, get some other people's perspectives. Once again, you're always more than free to tap in, give a perspective. I don't mind if you push back against what I'm saying. All I ask is that you focus on facts over feelings. And of course, most importantly, that you're able to undergird your argument with some form of factual information, right? So we don't want to deal with subjective truth. We want to deal with the truth, right? So I know there might be something that happened historically. Maybe we have a different perspective on something that took place in history, but at least it's rooted in something that is factual, right? And so we could do that once again and probably go for about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to shut it down unless we get some people to come on the call. But once again, we want to have a conversation about anti-Blackness and higher education, as well as secondary education. And the link is in the chat if you want to tap in, give your perspective, share your thoughts. And once again, I don't have a problem with someone having someone being a contrarian, right? You can come on, you can disagree with me. I have no problem with that. Just want to focus on facts over feelings. And of course, just make sure you're not being intellectually disingenuous. So with that said, the link is in the chat. I also put, once again, the link to my article that was published last Thursday in the Journal of Blacks in Higher Education, entitled "Why I'm Critical of Critical Theory," not critical race theory, of course, which is a derivative of critical theory, but why I'm critical of critical theory. And if you're unfamiliar with critical theory, I think this article will give you a great education on what critical theory is, how it was created. Of course, as many of us who are in the know are aware, critical theory was created in the academic cauldron of Marxism as a way of speaking out against capitalism, with the belief that socialism that one day would triumph over capitalism, but it morphed into something else as well, on which they became critical and began to question and trouble certain societal institutions and issues of power and hegemony as well. So that, of course, was in the 1920s. So with that being said, shout out to the Queen sister who actually came on and gave her perspective. Appreciate brother Carl in the chat. Appreciate brother I believe Untouchable in the chat, and we're going to shut it down. But make sure you hit that subscribe and like button, hit that notification bell. Make sure you check us out on LumumbaSpeaks.com. Once again, we're a Black Empowerment Initiative where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Until next time, you all know what to do. Peace.